The fluorescent lights in the church bathroom flickered as I stared at my reflection, mascara streaming down my cheeks in dark rivers. My hands trembled as I gripped the cold marble countertop, the emerald green fabric of my dress now feeling like a costume I had no right to wear. The pearl necklace Bob gave me for our 40th anniversary felt heavy around my neck, each pearl a reminder of the woman I used to be before this moment destroyed everything. Just 20 minutes earlier, I had walked into St. Mary's Cathedral with my head held high, proud to be the grandmother of the bride. I had spent months preparing for this day, 6 months to be exact, searching through department stores and boutiques until I found this perfect emerald dress. It was elegant, sophisticated, the kind of dress that made me feel beautiful at 62, the kind of dress Bob would have loved seeing me wear. I remember smoothing the fabric one last time in my car before walking into the church, whispering a little prayer of gratitude. "Thank you for letting me live to see this day," I had whispered to Bob's memory. "Thank you for letting me be here for Madison's wedding." Madison, my granddaughter, the little girl I had raised when her mother, Sarah, was too overwhelmed to handle motherhood alone. The child who used to climb into my lap and tell me I was her best friend in the whole world. The young woman who, just 2 years ago, had promised me I would have the seat of honor at her wedding. I had arrived early, wanting to greet the guests and help with any last-minute preparations. That's what grandmothers do, isn't it? We show up, we help, we love unconditionally. I was talking to Mrs. Henderson from our old neighborhood when I saw Madison walking toward me in her stunning white gown, her face glowing with that special bride radiance. But as she got closer, her expression changed. Her smile faded. Her eyes narrowed as they fixed on my dress, and I watched something cold and unfamiliar cross her face. This wasn't the Madison who used to braid my hair when she was 7. This wasn't the Madison who called me every Sunday just to chat. This was someone else entirely. She grabbed my arm firmly, her manicured nails digging into my skin through the green fabric, and pulled me aside to a quiet corner near the altar. "Grandma," she hissed, her voice low but sharp enough to cut glass, "I specifically asked you not to wear something so attention-grabbing. You're embarrassing everyone. Could you please go sit in the back?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward, my hand instinctively reaching for the church pew to steady myself. The woman who had helped raise her, who had attended every school play and graduation, who had taught her how to bake cookies and apply lipstick, was being asked to hide in the back row like some unwelcome stranger. "Madison?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'm your grandmother. I helped raise you." Her response was the final nail in my heart. "Well, maybe you should have taught me better boundaries." That moment shattered something inside me that I didn't even know could break. Not just my heart, but my entire sense of who I was in this family. In that instant, I became invisible, unwanted, a burden rather than the loving foundation I had always believed myself to be. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Now here I stood in this bathroom, wondering how the little girl who once promised I would always be her hero had grown into a woman who saw me as nothing but an embarrassment. To understand how deeply Madison's words cut me, you need to know what we once had. You need to know about the little girl who used to run into my arms every Friday afternoon, her backpack bouncing as she raced up my front porch steps, calling "Grandma Ellie, Grandma Ellie," like I was the most important person in her world. Madison came into my life when she was just 3 years old, after her father walked out on Sarah. I remember that first night Sarah showed up at my door, tears streaming down her face, carrying a sleeping Madison and a garbage bag full of clothes. "Mom, I can't do this alone," Sarah had whispered. "I'm working 2 jobs just to pay rent, and Madison needs stability. She needs someone who can be there for her." Without hesitation, I opened my door and my heart, From that moment on, Madison became the center of my universe. While Sarah worked her morning shift at the hospital and her evening shift at the diner, Madison lived with me. My house transformed from an empty nest into a home filled with giggles, crayon drawings on the refrigerator, and the sound of tiny feet running through the hallways. I was there for everything. Every scraped knee that needed kissing better, every nightmare that required middle-of-the-night comfort, every school morning when I braided her hair and packed her lunch with little notes that said, "Grandma loves you." I taught her to ride a bike in my driveway, holding onto the back of that pink bicycle until she was confident enough to pedal on her own. Our Friday afternoons were sacred. We had what we called fancy tea parties, where I would set out my good china, the delicate rose-patterned cups that had belonged to my mother. Madison would dress up in my old scarves and jewelry, and I would teach her about elegance and grace. We would practice proper posture, how to hold a teacup with your pinky up, and how to walk like a lady. "Grandma Ellie," she said to me one afternoon when she was 8, carefully applying my lipstick with tissues the way I had taught her, "when I grow up, I want to be exactly like you. Beautiful and smart and kind." Those words lived in my heart for years. I was there for every school play, sitting in the front row with my camera, cheering louder than any other parent when Madison took her bow. I was there for every piano recital, every spelling bee, every soccer game where she scored her first goal. When Madison made honor roll, I was the first person she called. When she had her heart broken by her first boyfriend, she cried on my shoulder for hours while I stroked her hair and told her she was too good for him anyway. The memory that haunts me most happened when Madison was 16. We were sitting on my back porch swing, sharing a bowl of the chocolate chip cookies we had baked together, when she suddenly turned to me with those bright brown eyes. "Grandma Ellie," she said, her voice serious and mature, "when I get married someday, I want you right there in the front row. You've been more like a mom to me than anyone. You're the one who taught me everything important." I reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Oh, sweetheart, I'll be there in my finest dress, crying happy tears and probably embarrassing you with how proud I am." She laughed and shook her head. "You could never embarrass me, Grandma. You're my hero." For 18 years, I believed that was true. I believed I was her hero, her role model, her safe place in a chaotic world. I believed that love, like ours, was unbreakable. The first crack in our perfect relationship appeared on a sunny Saturday morning in March, 6 months before Madison's wedding. I had been counting down the days since she announced her engagement to James, and I was more excited than I had been about anything in years. This was going to be my moment to shine as the proud grandmother, to finally show off the beautiful young woman I had helped raise. I had spent weeks searching for the perfect dress, visiting every department store and boutique in town. When I found it hanging in Nordstrom's, I knew immediately it was meant to be. The emerald green silk flowed like water, with delicate beading along the neckline that caught the light beautifully. It was sophisticated, age-appropriate, and elegant. Most importantly, it was the exact shade of green Bob always said made my eyes sparkle. I could hardly contain my excitement as I drove to Sarah's house that morning, the dress carefully hanging in the back seat. I had even brought matching shoes and a small clutch purse. I felt like a young woman again, preparing for the most important social event of my life. Madison was having coffee in Sarah's kitchen when I arrived, still in her pajamas with her hair in a messy bun. She looked so young and carefree, and my heart swelled with love and pride. This was my granddaughter, about to become a beautiful bride. "Madison, sweetheart," I called out, practically glowing with excitement. "I found it. I found the perfect dress for your wedding." I carefully removed the dress from its protective bag, holding it up against myself in front of the kitchen window where the morning light would show off the beautiful color. I had practiced this moment in my bedroom mirror, and I knew I looked radiant. But Madison's face changed instantly. The warm smile she had been wearing vanished. replaced by something I had never seen before, a look of horror mixed with embarrassment. She set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink against the saucer. "Grandma," she said slowly, her voice taking on a tone I didn't recognize. "That's pretty, but don't you think it's a little too bright? I mean, you don't want to draw attention away from the bride." The words hit me like cold water. I looked down at the dress, suddenly seeing it through her eyes instead of mine. Was it too bright? I had thought it was elegant, but maybe she was right. Maybe I was being inappropriate without realizing it. "Oh, honey," I stammered, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "It's just a lovely shade of green. Your grandfather always said I looked beautiful in green. I thought it would be perfect for such a special occasion." Sarah, who had been quietly watching this exchange from across the kitchen, stepped forward with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mom," she said carefully, "maybe something more neutral would be better. You know how wedding photos turn out. Bright colors can be distracting in pictures." I noticed something then that made my stomach clench. Madison and Sarah exchanged a look. It was quick, lasting only a second, but it was loaded with meaning I couldn't quite decipher. It was the kind of look that passes between people who have discussed something privately, the kind of look that excludes the third person in the room. "Of course," I heard myself saying, even though my heart was sinking. "I want everything to be perfect for your special day, Madison. I'll look for something else." Madison's smile returned, but it felt different now, more polite than genuine. "Thanks, Grandma. I just want everyone to feel comfortable." As I carefully folded the dress back into its bag, I told myself I was overreacting. They were just stressed about wedding planning. Every bride wants everything to be perfect. But deep down, a small voice whispered that something fundamental had just shifted between us. The dress incident was just the beginning. Over the following months, I watched helplessly as the walls went up around Madison, brick by brick, until I could barely recognize the relationship we once had. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was a slow, methodical erasure that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about my place in her life. The phone calls were the first thing to disappear. For years, Madison had called me every Sunday afternoon without fail. We would talk for hours about everything and nothing: her job, her friends, recipes she wanted to try, memories from her childhood. Those calls were the highlight of my week, the connection that made me feel like I still mattered in her adult life. But suddenly, the phone stopped ringing. When I called her instead, she seemed distracted, eager to get off the line. "Sorry, Grandma, I'm just so busy with wedding planning. Can I call you back later?" Later never came. I decided to take a more active approach, hoping to recapture the closeness we used to share. I called Madison with genuine excitement in my voice. "Sweetheart, I was thinking I could help with the wedding planning. Remember how we used to plan your pretend weddings when you were little? We could make this so special together." There was a pause that lasted too long before Madison responded. "Thanks, Grandma, but it's all handled. James's mom has been helping us with everything. She knows all the vendors and has really good taste." The words stung more than they should have. James's mom, who had known Madison for barely 2 years, apparently had better taste than the woman who had raised her. I swallowed my hurt and tried again. "Well, what about the reception? I could make my famous apple tarts, the ones you always loved. Remember how you used to help me make them for church functions?" "Oh, Grandma," Madison's voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, almost condescending. "We've hired a professional caterer. We don't really need homemade stuff for something this formal." Homemade stuff. As if the love I baked into every dessert I'd ever made for her was somehow inferior, embarrassing even. As if the hours we spent together in my kitchen, flour in our hair and laughter filling the room, meant nothing now that she was moving up in the world. The exclusions came next, each one a small knife to my heart. I wasn't invited to the dress shopping expedition, though James's mother and sister were both there. I saw the photos on Sarah's Facebook. Madison surrounded by women in elegant boutiques, all of them beaming except for the empty space where I should have been standing. "I thought you might be bored with all the trying on and fussing," Sarah explained when I asked. "You know how those things can drag on." I wasn't invited to the venue visits either. Apparently, it was easier with fewer people. I wasn't consulted about the menu, the flowers, or the music. When I offered to help address the wedding invitations, something Madison and I had practiced together when she was learning calligraphy, I was told that James's sister was handling it because she has really nice handwriting. Each rejection was delivered with a smile and a reasonable explanation, but they accumulated like stones in my chest, making it harder to breathe. I began to feel like a stranger hovering on the edges of my own granddaughter's life, watching through windows at a celebration I was no longer welcome to help create. The most painful part wasn't the individual rejections. It was the growing realization that Madison was actively replacing me with James's family, substituting their approval for the love that had sustained her entire childhood. The bridal shower was held at the elegant country club where James's parents were members. I should have seen it as a warning sign that I wasn't involved in planning it, but I was so grateful to be included at all that I didn't question why I received my invitation in the mail like a distant acquaintance rather than getting a personal call from Madison. I spent hours getting ready that morning, choosing a simple navy blue dress that I hoped would meet Madison's new standards of appropriateness. I wanted to look dignified, grandmother-like, invisible in all the right ways. I had learned my lesson about standing out. In my hands, I carried a carefully wrapped gift that meant more to me than anything else I owned. A vintage jewelry box that had belonged to Bob's mother, passed down through 3 generations of strong women in our family. It was made of rich mahogany with an intricate mother-of-pearl inlay, and when you opened it, a tiny ballerina still danced to the tune of Fur Elise. I had planned to give it to Madison on her wedding day, but something told me I should present it at the shower, surrounded by witnesses who could see the love behind the gesture. The country club was filled with perfectly dressed women holding delicate champagne flutes, their conversations floating through the air like expensive perfume. I recognized some faces, Sarah's friends, women from Madison's work, but most were strangers. James's family dominated the room, their laughter loud and confident, their designer clothes making my simple navy dress feel even more inadequate. Madison looked radiant in a flowing pink dress, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured animatedly. She was holding court in the center of the room, surrounded by James's female relatives who hung on her every word. When she saw me arrive, she waved briefly before turning back to her conversation, and I felt like an afterthought at my own granddaughter's celebration. I waited patiently through the gift opening, watching Madison squeal with delight over expensive kitchen appliances and luxury linens. When she finally reached my gift, wrapped in the vintage paper I had saved from my own wedding shower decades ago, the room seemed to quiet slightly. I felt my heart racing as she carefully untied the ribbon. Her face when she opened it told me everything I needed to know. There was no joy, no recognition of the treasure she was holding. Instead, there was something that looked uncomfortably close to embarrassment. She lifted the jewelry box briefly, barely glancing at the intricate craftsmanship or the dancing ballerina inside. "Oh," she said, her voice flat and dismissive. "Thanks, Grandma. That's very old-fashioned." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me, some with pity, others with the uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something cruel. Lisa, one of Sarah's longtime friends, tried to salvage the moment. "What a lovely antique piece, Eleanor. It's absolutely beautiful." But Madison's response was swift and final. "Yeah, I'll probably donate it. I'm more into modern jewelry anyway." The room fell completely silent. I watched as my family heirloom, the jewelry box where my own treasures had lived, where Bob's mother's wedding ring had been stored, where generations of love had been kept safe, became nothing more than a donation item in Madison's mind. I excused myself to the bathroom and sat in that sterile stall, crying as quietly as I could while the sounds of laughter and celebration continued outside. In that moment, I realized that the little girl who used to treasure every gift I gave her was gone, replaced by someone who saw my love as an embarrassment to be discarded. The morning of Madison's wedding, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror for what felt like hours. staring at two dresses hanging side by side. The safe choice. A beige dress that would make me invisible, forgettable, exactly what Madison seemed to want. And the emerald green dress, still hanging there after all these months, still beautiful, still the dress that made me feel like the woman Bob had fallen in love with. I thought about the jewelry box incident, about months of being pushed aside and replaced by James's family. I thought about the little girl who used to tell me I was her hero, and I made a decision that would change everything. If this was going to be the last family event where I mattered at all, I was going to look like the woman who had earned her place there. I arrived at St. Mary's Cathedral 30 minutes early, wanting to help with any last-minute details the way grandmothers are supposed to do. The emerald dress felt like armor as I walked through the church doors, and for the first time in months, I felt beautiful and confident. Several guests complimented me on how lovely I looked, and I began to think maybe I had been overthinking everything. I was arranging some flowers near the altar when I heard the rustle of silk behind me. Madison appeared in her wedding gown, looking absolutely stunning, but her face was already twisted with an anger I had never seen before. She moved toward me with the determined stride of someone preparing for battle. "Grandma!" she hissed, grabbing my arm so tightly I could feel her nails through the fabric. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The profanity shocked me. This was the young woman I had taught to say please and thank you, who I had raised to be respectful and kind. I looked around nervously, hoping no one else could hear us. "Madison, I don't understand. I just wanted to look nice for your special day." Her laugh was cold and bitter. "Look nice? You look like you're trying to upstage the bride. I specifically told you not to wear something so attention-grabbing. You're embarrassing everyone here." The words hit me like physical blows. I could see James's mother watching us from across the church, her face wearing an expression of smug satisfaction, as if this confrontation was exactly what she had been expecting. Other guests were beginning to notice the tension, their conversations dying down as they turned to stare at us. "Madison," I whispered, my voice trembling, "I'm your grandmother. I helped raise you. I changed your diapers, taught you to read, held you when you had nightmares. Doesn't that earn me the right to wear a nice dress to your wedding?" Her response shattered what was left of my heart. "Well, maybe you should have taught me better boundaries instead of making me feel guilty about having my own life." The cruelty in her voice was devastating, but it was the public nature of the humiliation that broke me completely. I could feel dozens of eyes on us, could hear the whispered conversations starting around the church. James's family members were watching with barely concealed satisfaction, as if they had won some victory I didn't even know we were fighting. "Could you please go sit in the back?" Madison continued, her voice getting louder. "I don't want you in the family photos looking like that." I stood there in my beautiful green dress, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my entire life. Without saying another word, I walked to the back row, past all the guests who had witnessed my granddaughter publicly reject the woman who had devoted 18 years of her life to raising her. I sat through the ceremony, with tears streaming down my face, watching the little girl I had loved unconditionally marry a man whose family had successfully erased me from her life. I slipped out of the church during the recessional. While everyone was distracted by the joy and celebration I was no longer welcome to share. The emerald green dress, that had felt like armor that morning, now felt like a costume I had no right to wear. I drove home in complete silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white, fighting back tears that threatened to blind me on the road. My house felt cavernous when I walked through the front door. The silence was deafening. No congratulatory phone calls, no family members stopping by to share wedding cake, no one checking to see if I was okay after what they had witnessed at the church. I was utterly, completely alone. I couldn't bring myself to change out of the dress immediately. Instead, I wandered through my house like a ghost, still wearing my pearls and my carefully applied makeup, now streaked with tears. Every room held memories of Madison that now felt like lies. The kitchen where we had baked countless cookies together. The living room where she had practiced piano recitals. The spare bedroom where she had slept during thunderstorms when she was too afraid to stay at Sarah's apartment. I found myself standing in front of the mantelpiece, staring at the collection of framed photographs that documented our relationship over the years. Madison as a toddler, her face covered in chocolate frosting from a birthday cake I had made. Madison at 7, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a drawing she had made of the two of us holding hands. Madison at her high school graduation, her arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride. The photographs felt like evidence of a relationship that had never really existed, or perhaps had existed only in my own desperate imagination. Had I been fooling myself all these years? Had I misread every hug, every I love you, every moment I thought we were building something unbreakable? I picked up the graduation photo, tracing Madison's young face with my finger, and spoke aloud to the empty room. "What did I do wrong, sweetheart? What did I do to make you hate me so much?" The silence that answered me was crushing. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. The thought of food made me nauseated, and I had been surviving on coffee and the occasional glass of water. My body felt hollowed out, as empty as my heart. And I couldn't sleep either. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Madison's face twisted with anger, heard her voice saying, "You're embarrassing everyone," over and over, like a broken record. On the second night, I found myself sitting on the floor of my bedroom, still in that green dress, surrounded by photo albums I had pulled from the closet. I was searching desperately for proof that our love had been real, that I hadn't imagined 18 years of devotion and connection. But every happy memory now felt contaminated by the knowledge of how easily Madison had thrown it all away. I picked up the phone to call Sarah, then put it down again. What was the point? Sarah had been complicit in pushing me aside, making excuses for Madison's behavior, prioritizing James's family over her own mother. I was truly alone in this pain. I found myself talking to Bob's photograph on my nightstand, my voice cracked and broken. "I don't know what I did wrong, honey. I loved that little girl like she was my own daughter. I gave her everything I had, and somehow it still wasn't enough. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I really am just an embarrassing old woman who doesn't know her place anymore." The house answered me with silence, and I realized that I had never felt so small, so worthless, so completely forgotten in my entire life. 3 days after the wedding, I finally changed out of the emerald dress. My hands shook as I hung it in the back of my closet, behind clothes I never wore anymore. I couldn't bear to look at it, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away either. It had become a symbol of everything I had lost, everything I had been foolish enough to believe about my place in this family. The house felt like a mausoleum filled with memories I could no longer trust. Every corner held remnants of a relationship that Madison had apparently outgrown without bothering to tell me. I needed to do something, anything, to stop the endless spiral of self-doubt that was consuming me from the inside out. I decided to clean out the spare bedroom, Madison's old room, thinking that maybe if I packed away the reminders, I could find some peace. Maybe it was time to accept that the little girl I had raised was gone forever, and this room was just another shrine to a love that had been one-sided all along. I started with the closet, pulling out old school projects, forgotten books, and boxes of childhood treasures I had saved for years. Each item felt like evidence of my own stupidity. Why had I kept all of this if it meant nothing to her? Why had I preserved every drawing, every report card, every little token of our shared history if she could dismiss me so easily? In the back corner of the closet, behind a stack of her old yearbooks, I found a worn shoebox that I didn't recognize. It was tied with a faded pink ribbon, and something about it made my heart race. With trembling fingers, I untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of letters and cards I had completely forgotten about. Things Madison had written to me over the years, carefully saved in her own handwriting. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized her childish script on the top envelope, addressed to "My best friend Grandma Ellie" in purple crayon. I sat down on the carpet, my legs suddenly too weak to support me, and opened the first letter. It was from when she was 8 years old, thanking me for teaching her to make pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse. The next was from middle school, a Mother's Day card where she had written, You're more like a mom to me than anyone else in the world. Another from high school, expressing gratitude for helping her through her first heartbreak. But it was the letter from her 18th birthday that broke me completely. Written just 4 years ago, when she was leaving for college, her handwriting was mature and thoughtful. Dear Grandma Ellie, I've been thinking about everything you've done for me, and I don't think I've ever properly thanked you. You stepped in when Dad left and gave me a mother's love when Mom was too overwhelmed to provide it. You taught me how to be strong, how to be kind, how to stand up for myself. You showed me what unconditional love looks like, and I promise I'll never forget what you've done for our family. You are my hero, and I love you more than words can say. I hope someday I can be half the woman you are. I held that letter against my chest and sobbed. Not the quiet, defeated tears I had been crying for days, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of recognition rather than despair. This was the real Madison, the one I had raised and loved. The person who had stood at that altar was someone else entirely, someone who had been influenced and changed by forces I was only beginning to understand. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something other than shame and self-doubt. I felt anger. I spent the entire night reading through Madison's letters, each one a piece of evidence that our love had been real, meaningful, and profound. By dawn, I was surrounded by scattered papers on my bedroom floor, tissues crumpled around me, but for the first time in days, my tears weren't tears of self-pity. They were tears of recognition, and surprisingly, relief. As the morning light filtered through my bedroom windows, I caught sight of myself in the dresser mirror. The woman staring back at me looked exhausted and hollow, but there was something different in her eyes. For days, I had been seeing a foolish old woman who had overstepped her bounds, who had embarrassed herself and everyone around her. But now, holding Madison's words in my hands, I saw someone else entirely. I saw Eleanor Hartwell, the woman who had raised 2 children as a single mother when my first husband left. I saw the teacher who had spent 35 years shaping young minds, who had been respected and loved by hundreds of students over the decades. I saw the woman who had stepped in without hesitation when Sarah needed help, who had given Madison stability and unconditional love during the most formative years of her life. I stood up slowly, my joints protesting after sitting on the floor all night, and walked to my dresser. There, in a small silver frame, was a photo Bob had taken of me on our last anniversary. I was laughing at something he had said, my face radiant with joy and confidence. That woman in the photograph knew her worth. She didn't apologize for taking up space or for loving deeply. She didn't shrink to make others comfortable. "What happened to you?" I whispered to my reflection, placing the photo next to the mirror. "When did you start believing that loving someone meant accepting disrespect?" The truth hit me like a physical force. I had been so desperate to maintain my relationship with Madison that I had allowed her to treat me as less than I was. I had accepted the exclusion from wedding planning, the dismissal of my gifts, the relegation to the back row, all because I was terrified of losing her completely. But in trying so hard not to lose her, I had lost myself. I thought about all the times over the past months when I should have spoken up, should have demanded the respect I deserved. When Madison criticized my dress choice, I should have said, "This dress is beautiful, and I'm wearing it." When she excluded me from wedding planning, I should have said, "I raised you, and I deserve to be part of this celebration." When she dismissed my jewelry box, I should have said, "This represents 3 generations of strong women, and you're throwing away your heritage." But I hadn't said any of those things because I had been operating from a place of fear rather than strength. I had been so afraid of being seen as the stereotypical demanding grandmother that I had allowed myself to become invisible instead. I picked up the letter Madison had written at 18 and read it again, focusing on specific words. "You taught me how to be strong, how to stand up for myself." The irony was devastating. I had taught her to be strong, but I had forgotten how to be strong myself. I walked to my closet and pulled out the emerald green dress, holding it up to the light. It was beautiful. It was elegant. It was appropriate for a grandmother to wear to her granddaughter's wedding. There had been absolutely nothing wrong with this dress or with my desire to look beautiful for Madison's special day. The problem wasn't me. The problem was that I had allowed other people to convince me I was the problem. That realization changed everything. The old Eleanor would have called Madison immediately, desperate to reconcile and apologize for things that weren't her fault. The old Eleanor would have begged Sarah to intervene, would have sent flowers with groveling notes, would have done anything to restore the peace, even if it meant sacrificing her dignity once again. But the woman who woke up that morning was different. This Eleanor understood that real change doesn't come from grand gestures or emotional outbursts. It comes from quiet, deliberate actions that rebuild your life from the foundation up. I started with something simple but significant. I called the Riverside Literacy Center, a place I had volunteered years ago before I became so consumed with being the perfect grandmother. The director, Ms. Patricia Williams, remembered me immediately. "Eleanor, we've missed you so much. Are you interested in coming back? We have more adult learners than ever, and they could really use someone with your teaching experience." "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "I'd like to start this week." For the first time in years, I was doing something purely for myself, something that reminded me of who I was beyond my roles as mother and grandmother. Teaching had always been my calling, and I had abandoned it to be constantly available for a family that had gradually stopped valuing my availability. Next, I reached out to friends I had neglected while orbiting around Madison's life. I called Dorothy Fleming, my neighbor, who had been trying to get me to join her book club for 2 years. "Dorothy, is that book club invitation still open?" "Of course, dear. We're reading Educated this month. I think you'll find it quite relevant." I also enrolled in the watercolor painting class at the community college, something I had wanted to do since Bob passed away, but never found time for because I was always babysitting, helping with errands, or making myself available for family emergencies that somehow never seemed to include me in the solution, only in the cleanup. The most important change was the smallest one. I stopped being perpetually available. When Sarah called on Thursday evening, asking if I could watch Lucas on Saturday because she and James had last-minute plans, I took a deep breath and said something I had never said before. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but I have plans that day. I'm starting a watercolor class." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. "Plans?" Sarah repeated, as if the concept of me having a life outside of their convenience was incomprehensible. "But Mom, it's just for a few hours. Can't you reschedule your little art thing?" My little art thing. The dismissive tone was so familiar, so automatic, that I realized this was how they had been talking to me for years. Everything I wanted was little, unimportant, easily sacrificed for their needs. "No, Sarah, I can't reschedule. I've committed to this class, and I intend to honor that commitment." "Well, I guess I'll have to find someone else," she said, her voice carrying a note of irritation that suggested this was somehow my fault for having the audacity to live my own life. "Yes, you will," I replied calmly. "I'm sure you'll figure something out." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of setting a boundary and maintaining it. I wasn't being mean or spiteful. I was simply no longer willing to drop everything at a moment's notice to solve problems I hadn't created. I also started seeing Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a counselor who specialized in family dynamics and boundary setting. Not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand how I had allowed myself to become so diminished and how to prevent it from happening again. The sessions were enlightening and empowering, giving me tools I wished I had possessed years earlier. 3 months after the wedding, I was teaching my Tuesday evening literacy class when my phone buzzed with an urgent text from Sarah. "Mom, call me now. Emergency with Madison." The old Eleanor would have dropped everything, excused herself from class, and called back within minutes, heart racing with maternal panic. But I was in the middle of helping Maria, a 45-year-old woman from El Salvador, sound out the words in her first English novel. Her face was glowing with pride as she slowly but confidently read aloud. And I wasn't about to abandon that moment for another manufactured crisis. I finished the class, helped my students pack up their materials, and drove home before returning Sarah's call. When I finally called back at 9:30 p.m., Sarah's voice was frantic with barely controlled hysteria. "Mom, where have you been? I've been calling and texting for hours." "I was teaching my literacy class," I replied calmly, settling into my favorite armchair with a cup of tea. "What's going on with Madison?" "Everything is falling apart. Her marriage is a disaster. James has been staying at his parents' house for 2 weeks because he says Madison is impossible to live with. She's been crying constantly, calling in sick to work, and she keeps saying she feels empty inside, like she doesn't know who she is anymore." I sipped my tea and waited for Sarah to continue, noting how her voice carried a tone of desperation I hadn't heard in years. For months, Madison's happiness with James and his family had been the golden standard against which everything else was measured. Now that golden life was tarnishing, and suddenly my opinion mattered again. James told her she's become selfish and cruel, and maybe he's right. She's been horrible to his family too, picking fights over nothing. His mother says Madison has been completely ungrateful for everything they've done for her. The irony wasn't lost on me. Madison had learned to be cruel by practicing on me first, and now that same cruelty was destroying the relationship she had prioritized over our bond. "I'm sorry to hear Madison is struggling," I said, and I genuinely meant it. Despite everything, I didn't want her to suffer. "Mom, could you talk to her? She always listened to you. Maybe you could help her figure out what's wrong." This was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for, the moment when my family would need me again and expect me to drop everything to rescue them from consequences of their own making. 3 months ago, I would have driven to Madison's house immediately, armed with homemade soup and unconditional forgiveness. "Sarah," I said carefully, "Madison made it very clear at her wedding that she doesn't value my input. She asked me to sit in the back row because I was embarrassing everyone. I think it's best if you handle this situation." The silence on the other end was so complete, I wondered if the call had dropped. "But Mom," Sarah finally stammered, "you always help us figure things out. You always know what to do." "I do know what to do," I replied, "but I'm not going to chase after someone who has repeatedly shown me that my presence in her life is unwelcome. If Madison wants my help, she knows where to find me." "You're really not going to help your own granddaughter?" "Sarah, I spent 18 years helping Madison become the person she is today. If she's struggling with the consequences of her choices, that's not my emergency to solve anymore." After I hung up, I sat in my chair feeling something remarkable: peace. For the first time in my relationship with my daughter and granddaughter, I wasn't the one desperately trying to maintain connection. They needed something from me, and I had the power to choose whether or not to give it. 4 days after my conversation with Sarah, I was in my art studio, the spare bedroom I had transformed after removing all traces of Madison's childhood, mixing watercolors for a landscape painting when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the window, I saw Madison's silver Honda, and my heart did a familiar little skip. But this time, instead of excitement, I felt a calm sort of readiness. Madison looked terrible. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face was puffy from crying, and she was wearing wrinkled sweatpants and an oversized hoodie that made her look like the lost little girl she had once been. But I reminded myself that appearances could be deceiving, and this same person had publicly humiliated me just 3 months ago. She knocked on my door hesitantly, not using her key as she had for so many years. When I opened it, she immediately broke down in tears, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "Grandma, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me. James left me. He says I'm selfish and horrible, and maybe he's right. I've been having panic attacks and I can't sleep, and I feel like I'm disappearing. I don't know who I am anymore." The old Eleanor would have immediately pulled her inside, made tea, and started solving her problems. But this Eleanor stayed in the doorway, arms crossed, observing the granddaughter who had once been her whole world. "What do you think, Madison?" I asked quietly. She looked up at me with surprise, as if she had expected me to immediately return to my role as her emotional caretaker. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you think you've been selfish and horrible? And if so, why do you think that happened? Madison's face crumpled again. I don't know. Everything just started going wrong after the wedding. James's family keeps criticizing everything I do. His mother says I'm ungrateful and that I don't appreciate how much they've helped me plan the perfect wedding. She says I'm just like my grandmother, entitled and attention-seeking. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. So that's what this was about. James's mother had been systematically poisoning Madison against me, and Madison had been too insecure in her new social position to resist. And what do you think about what she said? I asked. Madison looked genuinely confused. I don't know. At the time, it made sense. You did wear that really bright dress to my wedding, and it did seem like you were trying to get attention. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. After everything. After raising her. After the letters she had written. After 18 years of unconditional love. She still believed that I had been trying to upstage her at her own wedding. Madison, I said, my voice calm but firm. I need you to understand something. I will always love you, but I will never again allow you to treat me as less than the woman who devoted years of her life to raising you. That dress was elegant and appropriate, and I had every right to look beautiful at my granddaughter's wedding. Her eyes widened, as if she had never heard me speak with such authority before. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it will be based on mutual respect. I will not be your emergency emotional support system when your other relationships fail, and I will not accept being treated as an embarrassment when times are good. You need to decide what kind of relationship you want with me, but it will be on terms that honor who I am and what I've meant in your life. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken expectations and disappointments. 2 weeks after my confrontation with Madison, I was watering my garden when Dorothy Fleming appeared at my fence, her face flushed with indignation and something that looked like righteous anger. Eleanor, I need to tell you something that's been eating at me since Madison's wedding, she said, gripping the fence post so tightly her knuckles were white. I should have spoken up sooner, but I wasn't sure if it was my place. I set down my watering can and gave her my full attention. Dorothy had been my neighbor for 15 years, and I had never seen her this agitated. What is it, Dorothy? It's about what really happened at that wedding and why Madison treated you so horribly. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to reveal. My nephew Tommy works at the country club where they had the reception. He's one of the servers there, and he hears everything. A chill ran down my spine, but I remained calm. Go on. Eleanor, James's mother, that awful Catherine Chen. She spent the entire cocktail hour before the ceremony talking to anyone who would listen about how inappropriate you were, how you were trying to upstage the bride, how you were clingy and didn't know your place. Dorothy's voice was shaking with anger. She was poisoning people against you before you even walked into that church. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The looks I had received from strangers, the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached, the cold shoulders from people I didn't even know. It hadn't been about my dress at all. But here's the thing, Eleanor, Dorothy continued, her voice getting stronger. Most people weren't buying it. Tommy said several guests were appalled by what Catherine was saying. They thought she was being cruel and inappropriate, talking badly about the bride's grandmother on her wedding day. What else did Tommy hear? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He said Madison spent most of the reception crying in the bathroom, not happy tears, real sobbing. She kept saying to her bridesmaids that she felt like she had betrayed someone important. But every time she tried to find you to apologize, Catherine would intercept her and remind her that you had embarrassed the family. My heart broke a little more for Madison, understanding now that she had been as much a victim of Catherine's manipulation as I had been. But Eleanor, here's the most important part, Dorothy said, leaning closer. Tommy overheard Catherine talking to her sister-in-law about her strategy. She said she needed to get rid of your influence over Madison completely because she wanted to be the primary grandmother figure for any future great-grandchildren. She actually used the word eliminate when talking about you." The cold calculation behind it all took my breath away. This hadn't been about wedding etiquette or family dynamics. This had been a deliberate campaign to erase me from Madison's life so that Catherine could take my place as the family matriarch. "There's more," Dorothy said grimly. "Tommy said Catherine has been telling James that Madison needs to choose sides between her old family and her new one. She's been systematically isolating Madison from everyone who knew her before the wedding." I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in months. Pure, justified anger. Not at Madison, but at the woman who had manipulated my vulnerable granddaughter into betraying the people who truly loved her. "Dorothy," I said quietly, "I think it's time Madison learned the truth about who her real enemies are." The war for Madison's heart hadn't been fair, but it wasn't over yet. 3 days after my conversation with Dorothy, I found Madison sitting on my front porch steps when I returned from my watercolor class. She looked different than she had during her last desperate visit, cleaner, calmer, but somehow smaller, as if the weight of understanding was pressing down on her shoulders. In her hands, she held a thick envelope and the mahogany jewelry box she had so cruelly dismissed at her bridal shower. The sight of that box, now polished to a warm shine, made my heart skip with cautious hope. "Hi, Grandma," she said quietly, standing up as I approached. "I've been sitting here for an hour, trying to figure out what to say to you." I unlocked my front door but didn't immediately invite her in. The woman I had become needed to hear what she had to say before deciding whether to open my home to her again. "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation," Madison continued, her voice trembling slightly. "About what you said regarding mutual respect and boundaries. And I've been thinking about James's mother and some things she said about you." She held up the jewelry box, and I could see tears gathering in her eyes. "I took this home after the bridal shower, and I was going to donate it just like I said. But every time I looked at it, something felt wrong. So I opened it and really looked inside for the first time." Madison carefully opened the box, and the tiny ballerina began her familiar dance to Für Elise. "There's an inscription I never noticed before. It says, 'To my darling Catherine, may you always dance through life with joy. Love, Robert, 1952. My breath caught. I had forgotten about that inscription. It was from Bob's father to his mother on their wedding day. "This isn't just some old jewelry box," Madison whispered. "This represents 3 generations of love stories. Bob's parents, you and Grandpa Bob, and you wanted me to be the 4th generation. I was looking at it all wrong because someone taught me to see it as old-fashioned instead of treasured." She reached into the envelope and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in her careful handwriting. "I wrote you a letter. Actually, I wrote you 12 letters over the past 2 weeks, trying to find the right words. This is the one where I finally told the truth." I took the letter, noting how her hands shook as she passed it to me. The first lines made my throat tight with emotion. "Dear Grandma Ellie, I've been trying to figure out when I stopped being the granddaughter you raised and became someone I don't recognize. I think it started when I got so desperate to fit into James's family that I let them convince me my own family wasn't good enough." "Madison," I said softly, "would you like to come inside? I think we have a lot to talk about." Relief flooded her face as she nodded. As we walked into my living room, I noticed her looking around with new eyes, seeing the home where she had grown up not as something to be ashamed of, but as something that had shaped her into the person she was meant to be. "I need you to know something," she said, as we sat down on my couch. "I love you, and I want to rebuild our relationship. But I understand now that love without respect isn't really love at all. I want to learn how to be the granddaughter you deserve, not the one who takes you for granted." "And I want to learn how to be the grandmother I should have been all along," I replied. "One who loves you enough to expect better from you." 6 months later, I stood in my art studio wearing the emerald green dress, carefully applying brushstrokes to a self-portrait I had been working on for weeks. The woman in the painting looked confident and serene, her eyes holding the wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and choosing to rebuild rather than retreat. The dress in the painting shimmered with the same dignity it had always possessed, no longer a symbol of humiliation, but of reclaimed power. Through the window, I could see Madison's car pulling into my driveway. She came every Sunday now for what we called our intentional tea time. Not the desperate visits of someone seeking rescue, but the deliberate choice of a woman who valued our relationship enough to nurture it consistently. The transformation in both of us had been remarkable to witness. Madison had left James 3 months ago, finally understanding that a marriage built on rejecting her true self could never bring her happiness. She had moved into a small apartment downtown and was rebuilding her life from scratch, just as I had done. When she knocked on my door, I opened it to find her carrying a bouquet of yellow roses and wearing a simple blue dress that reminded me of the young woman I had raised. Authentic, unpretentious, beautiful in her own skin. "Good afternoon, Grandma Ellie," she said, offering me the flowers with a genuine smile. "How did your art class go this week?" "Wonderful," I replied, accepting the roses and breathing in their sweet fragrance. "Mrs. Patterson said my use of light and shadow has really improved. And how was your therapy session?" "Enlightening, as always," Madison said, settling into the chair that had become hers during these weekly visits. "Dr. Rodriguez is helping me understand how I lost myself, trying to become someone I thought others wanted me to be." As I prepared our tea using my mother's rose-patterned china, the same set Madison and I had used for our childhood tea parties, I marveled at how different these conversations were from our old dynamic. We talked as equals now, two women who had both learned hard lessons about self-respect and authentic relationships. "I have something to tell you," Madison said, her voice carrying excitement rather than the desperation that had characterized our conversations months ago. "I got accepted into the graduate program for social work. I want to help other women who've lost themselves in toxic relationships." Pride swelled in my chest, but it was a different kind of pride than I had felt before. This wasn't the desperate pride of a grandmother clinging to reflected glory, but the quiet satisfaction of watching someone you love find their true purpose. "I'm so proud of you," I said, and meant it completely. "You're becoming exactly who you're meant to be." "I learned that from you," Madison replied, reaching across the small table to squeeze my hand. "You showed me what it looks like to lose yourself, and then have the courage to find yourself again." On the table between us sat the mahogany jewelry box, now permanently stationed in my living room where it belonged. Madison had asked me to keep it until she was in a relationship that honored her heritage rather than demanding she abandon it. As afternoon sunlight streamed through my windows, illuminating the emerald dress I wore with such confidence now, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. I had learned that love without boundaries destroys both the giver and the receiver. Madison had learned that authentic relationships require you to show up as yourself, not as someone else's idea of who you should be. We were both different women now, stronger, wiser, more honest with ourselves and each other. And somehow, that made our love deeper and more real than it had ever been before.